Gentlemen, welcome. Great to be here with you at this summit. Why don't we just start, because we have a limited amount of time here. Adam, Brandon, Brian, going down the line here, and just tell us who you are and what you do, and maybe even hit on that word AI.
Awesome. So I'm Adam Brie. I'm co-founder and CEO of Skydio, and we make small, light, smart AI-powered drones. So our drones are used by a wide range of customers. They're used by consumers to capture cool video. They're used by enterprise companies for infrastructure inspection. They're used by public safety agencies to respond to emergencies, search and rescue, get critical situational awareness, and then they're also used by the DoD. So we've delivered thousands of systems to the Army, to the Marines, to allies, and we have hundreds of systems now being used every day in Ukraine. And our basic mission as a company is to just make these things smart enough that they become easy to use for anybody for whatever task they're trying to accomplish. We're really trying to build in the skills of an expert pilot into the drone.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. My name is Brandon Tseng. I'm the president and co-founder of Shield AI. I used to be in the Navy. I spent 7 years primarily as a Navy SEAL, but also as a surface warfare officer at the start of my career. Shield AI's mission is to protect service members and civilians with intelligent systems. We are primarily focused on building the world's best AI pilot. When we say AI pilot as it relates to the military, it's about enabling aircraft to operate without GPS, without communications, and then in swarms or teams. We have our AI pilot on a small quadcopter that goes inside buildings ahead of special operations forces and infantry. We are putting our AI pilot on a medium-sized aircraft called the VBAT that provides an operational level of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And then we are also putting that AI pilot on fighter-type aircraft. And just when I think about AI as it relates to aircraft, or what Shield AI is primarily focused on, again, I just think the best way to think about it is self-driving technology for aircraft.
How you doing? I'm Brian Schimpf. I'm co-founder and CEO of Anduril. You just heard all about what Anduril does, so I'm going to skip most of that. We've been working on a variety of technologies, from counter-drone systems, building, unmanned platforms of all kinds. And throughout it has been an interesting journey of figuring out what is, the next 20, 30 years of a defense going to look like? How is autonomy and unmanned and AI systems going to be adopted? What does that really look like? So it's been a very interesting journey of figuring out how to get this fielded and applied. And we've got hundreds of systems deployed in the field today using a variety of AI technologies in often very straightforward ways to simplify the lives of operators as much as possible.
All right, thanks, gentlemen. Where I want to go now in the conversation, and just kind of planning out that we'll talk about where we are today, although this panel is about the future of modern warfare, is for you to share with us where AI, artificial intelligence, really needs to be in our military. Where are we lacking it most? Congratulations. The policy community in Washington, D.C. is convinced that AI is important, that we need AI. In fact, you have a lot of people who know nothing about technology, but they know they have to say AI every time they talk about the future. So you're there. What they don't know is where they need AI. Where is the most important place to put it? Because, as I understand it, I don't know, you could fill a field in some sort of, website and, it completes your name. And I have AI, ladies and gentlemen, we're here. The future is here. That can't be what we're talking about when we think about what we need for our military. So let's go down the line. Brian, we'll start with you since you went last. Now you go first. Talk to us about where, in your judgment, we need AI the most, not just where Anduril's providing, but as an enterprise, Department of Defense and our military.
Yeah, so when I think of what we've seen as most applicable today, really it's automation. When I say that, it's taking a lot of the mechanical, repetitive, predictable aspects of what you want to do that today we have fleets of humans actually operating. So you look at where there's been successes on this, it's taking kind of the rudimentary parts of mission planning, or looking at images, or telling you what's actually going on in very kind of predictable ways. And that's really where I've seen kind of AI shine to date. It's those things like self-driving, where it's like, this is a definable, clear thing that we want to do, and we want to drive as much as possible. And so what this really enables, what this buys you, is it's enabling technology that gets you scale, gets you mass. It's how we actually do things at a huge volume, where today we are manpower limited. We are not going to be able to have the number of troops, the amount of communications, anything like that, to be able to fight the way we're currently fighting. And AI kind of broadly gets you this ability to scale up to hundreds and thousands of systems, being able to do a much, much higher volume of activity that's much harder to defeat, it's much harder to counter, and you can conduct warfare in a much more precise and large-scale way than has been possible to date. It's not going to look like sort of the counterterrorism fight where you have weeks and weeks of time to be able to plan any specific mission. Things are going to move much faster, and you got to be able to respond in quantity. And that, in our head, is what really kind of that AI theory of victory looks like. It's how do I enable scale and mass and get that to work with the precision and accountability that we expect for the military.
Brandon, can you build on that? I mean, if you disagree, please highlight where you might disagree, but also kind of tell us where in kind of the spectrum of warfighting we need it most, kind of building on what Brian just shared.
Sure, and Brian and I agree on so much of this stuff.
I'm shocked.
I've talked about this stuff in the past, but things that he mentioned, speed, and I'll start with that one. I think many people in this room are familiar with the OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. Colonel John Boyd from the Air Force back in the 60s wrote about it, but it's just a fundamental principle around warfare. Whoever OODAs the faster will win the battles, they'll win the overall war when it comes down to it, assuming you have a good strategy. And what AI does, it enables you to execute those OODA loops at incredible rates and at incredible scale. Scales that I fundamentally believe will transform the character of warfare, as many of our Secretary of Defenses have stated before. And so that is its premise, is why it's such a fundamental technology. It's an enabling technology. It's why you see Russia, China making comments about, he who leads in AI will rule the world, why China wants to be the leaders in AI by, I think, 2025. But then if you boil it down to the next level, right? Going from the OODA loops, well, what are those? If AI is an enabling technology, what is it enabling? In my view, I think there's really four fundamental areas in the defense space in modern warfare where it's going to be a critical game changer. And I can speak probably relatively intelligently to two of them. And so the four areas being autonomy, right? And so that's Shield AI's bread and butter, battle management systems, hypersonics, and space. And I believe those are, if you look at the battlefield or what the battlefield of the future is going to look like, those are going to be the four areas where we really need to move quickly. When I think about autonomy, the importance that plays, we see our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they are building up their electronic warfare capabilities. They are jamming GPS, they are jamming communications, which are traditional assets that we've become so reliant on. Our Predator drones, our smaller versions of drones that rely on GPS. That's what they targeted, right? They saw what the United States was doing in the war on terror. They said, great, a critical vulnerability is their ability to communicate. It's their reliance on GPS. Let's attack that. So that's why autonomy plays a super important role, because if you're going to have the assets that operate in these contested electronic warfare environments, you need to have assets that can maneuver, make intelligent decisions in there. And it just so happens that this amazing technology that the commercial sector invested so much in, self-driving, is directly applicable to the defense space, to operating in these denied environments. With battle management systems, I think about the ability to make many decisions very quickly, at speed, at scale. That is, fundamentally, when you think about what the military wants to do. They want a decision engine that's aiding them in making the decisions, letting them know where their assets are, what those assets can do, what their munitions availability is, and then swiping right or swiping left for all intents and purposes on enabling action. And I think just autonomy and battle management go hand in hand, because you can have all the battle management in the world, but if you don't have the assets that can actually go in and make a difference on the battlefield, the battle management is less important, or it doesn't matter as much. You're still going to be slowed down by that speed to act. And then space and hypersonics are the two areas that I can't comment as much on, but I do think
You're in Washington. You're free to opine on things you don't know anything about.
I just think you see it's making a big difference. Speed, what we call the tyranny of distance is something that's real. When we think about what's going on in the Pacific with China, when we think about Russia, again, going back to the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, the faster you can do that, the offset that you can do that at is extremely important. That's why hypersonics are important. Same with space, right? That offset, that speed, that mass that you can collect intelligence to make better decisions is super important. And so AI plays a role in all four of those. For Shield AI, it's the autonomy play first and foremost, but.
So I mean, that's super helpful. So if we're measuring whether the Department of Defense, U.S. military, the government as a whole is effectively leveraging AI where it matters most, you're nominating, look in these four buckets, right? From space to battle management to autonomy, and the fourth one that will come to mind in just a moment here. But those are the key buckets. Adam, tell us about your sense of AI, where it matters most, where you stand with respect to Brandon's four buckets in terms of where we need to look and invest most. You guys haven't used the word invest, but I'm sure you would appreciate if our government invested more in these areas.
Yeah, so I generally agree with what's been said. I think the one thing I'd add, and this might be a little bit counterintuitive for a company that's very focused on AI, we really believe that there's no substitute for human judgment and human creativity, and AI is just a really powerful way of delivering more leverage to people to be more effective and help them do their jobs better, faster, and safer. And I think one very tangible thing that we can look at to understand the impact, and I think also to see the trajectory, is very simple, just like the ratio between how many operators are involved in flying a drone. And historically, even though there wasn't a person on the drone, there'd be a lot of people involved in flying it. You might have a team of 5 or 10 people who are responsible for piloting the thing, looking at the data streams, dispatching it, and that is changing now. The technology for the drone to fly itself, sense its environment, respond to what it sees, makes it such that you can be very effective like one-to-one, one operator with a drone, and they don't necessarily need to be focused on flying it. They can be focused on the mission and just getting data from the drone. And I think we're headed towards a place where you can have one operator responsible for multiple drones, 5, 10, hundreds, and eventually maybe someday thousands. And I think that's a super, super powerful operating paradigm. But the goal is not to remove the person from the loop, it's just to make them as effective as possible.
Embedded in your response, Adam, is the value proposition, right? If we're going to save some serious taxpayer dollars, to the extent the government is able to invest and realize this, because it's not going to be the 1-to-1 ratio, right? And you're saying it could be one operator for a dozen, or perhaps I heard you say hundreds. That's certainly something you would think would interest the U.S. taxpayer and the customer in the Pentagon or so wherever in government and the U.S. Congress. I want to hit on Ukraine just a minute with our time we have left. But first, I need you each to comment about your customer, because you're doing something very, very difficult. You are trying to go to a place to convince them to take a bet on something that is only beginning to be proven, and asking them to depart from how they've been doing business for a very long time. So disruption, of course, is sine qua non for what we'd expect to come out of our most innovative pockets in our country, Silicon Valley and elsewhere. But doing that inside the 5-sided building called the Pentagon, I gotta expect is really difficult. So Brandon, I'm going to pick on you first since you haven't gone first yet. Talk to us about your customer and how it's going, convincing them of the value proposition here.
Yeah, no, working with the government is hard. It's extremely hard, and it's why I don't think you see a lot of companies reach a sense of scale because of that difficulty. It's slow. That's one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of companies reach the scale that is required to make an impact. But at the same time, and I'll say it's to no one individual's fault in the government. What I love about working with the government customer is there are so many people in government, whether it's in Congress, whether it's in the Pentagon, whether it's in the DoD, that it's inspiring to work with them. They are tackling the hardest, most existential problems that the government, that America needs to focus on, and they're really complex problems, and they need all the help they can get. And so for all the challenges of working with government, I will just say the individuals, the champions that Shield AI has worked with, it's been an absolute honor. It's humbling to work with them. It's refreshing to know that there are Americans going to work each and every day who are working on these really complex problems. And I think that's something, as a country, everybody really needs to take a step back and say, you know what, that is good, honorable work. It's something that we should all be proud of.
Brian, I'm going to throw you a softball as a follow-on to that. Is the government putting their money where their mouth is?
No, obviously.
I heard that I said no, just predicting.
When you look at like how these things play out in terms of like, what do modern technology companies spend? Take a Tesla, take any of these companies that are building, kind of modern hardware, software-enabled systems. What's the percentage that they're spending on software versus hardware? It's a much, much higher percentage on the software side than I think what you see in the U.S. government. So one of the challenges that's been really hard is, a lot of people say to us is like, why don't you just do a software business? Like, why don't you just that seems to be what the differentiation is. That's the really interesting piece. And the reality is there hasn't been a believable or workable business model to do software on these, basically these weapon systems that actually make sense. It's a very small percentage. You're typically subordinated in a niche role. And then the broader part of this is to actually enable what is possible with taking advantage of more autonomy, taking advantage of how AI can enable these to go. Just how you network systems, how you have them collaborate together, all of those sort of concepts that everyone believes need to exist. You have to think about the holistic system differently. You have to think about what is the hardware I'm building, what sensors are on it, how is this composed, how will I fight with it, how will I train with it, what's the development process look like? So it actually requires a pretty significant shift in kind of nearly every aspect of how you run these programs to fully take advantage of how best to do this. And this is what Silicon Valley has figured out. When you look at what has made Facebook successful, well, maybe not a great example right now, but Google, Apple, all these companies, they've learned how to iterate very quickly, use data to understand how to improve, how to actually ship these things at scale. And that is a very, very sophisticated, challenging process that is wildly different than, say, a 15-year refresh cycle on an aircraft or something like that. And so it is a real shift. It's a real different way they have to operate. So I think beyond sort of just the budget questions, which that will take time, that will happen over sort of decades as these things move. It's been a real challenge to think through the programmatics. And one thing I will say to DoD's credit is DoD as an organization, over the past 100+ years, has reinvented itself many times over. How they've actually adopted different ways of fighting, precision munitions, using aircraft, underwater, submarines. Like all of this has been substantial shifts that have changed, how they fight, how they organize, how they operate, and they have been able to adopt change. It's not as fast as anyone wants, and I think the discussion has shifted from sort of an if we will adopt these technologies or does this actually make sense, now it's how. How are we going to do it? What does this practically look like? How do we think about what this costs? What do these programs look like? And I've seen that over the last 5 years in a really substantial way, which is fantastic, right? So I think the shift is happening. It is hard. It is a large organization. There are long-term commitments. You're not changing this stuff on a dime, but there's a real willingness to start to look at holistically how are we approaching this, which is fantastic. It's at the beginning, but it's good.
Adam, if you could comment on this question, but in particular, I'm curious if you run into the view that you're just not ready. The technology is not ready enough for us to invest as you're thinking about engaging with the customer.
So I think that, I generally agree with what Brian said there. I think Anduril in particular has done a nice job of trying to sort of like advocate for this new model where companies should be taking product development risk and the government should be focused on just buying the best product, which is difficult or different from how things have traditionally worked. I would say that so we have a little bit of a different history as a company. We started in the civilian space, and we always saw that there was likely a lot of defense application for small, light, easy-to-use drones, but wasn't our initial focus. And we're the direct beneficiary of, I think, really excellent work by a lot of folks on the government side. So Defense Innovation Unit was a huge factor in kind of like making the bridge for us to get into the defense space. A lot of great folks at the Army Program Office. And so I think there's a lot of great stuff happening. I think in general in our space, the DoD really realized that these small, light civilian drones that were affordable, super easy to use, had enormous value for soldiers, and they leaned into that and they set up programs to go out and find companies working on them and to ultimately buy them. So I think there's a lot of good stuff happening. It may not be happening as fast as folks want, but the general trend line, I think, is very positive.
Remaining time, I want to challenge the title of this discussion. This is AI in the future of modern warfare, and actually just say AI in warfare today. And by that, I'm talking about what we're seeing on the ground. And before we came on stage, we were talking about Ukraine. And much to say about Ukraine. Probably the most important is what you see when people have the will to fight for their freedom. That's probably the most significant thing. But behind that is what happens when these new technologies enter the battlefield and what it allows for. And what we're seeing, of course, is that it demonstrates that what we thought was a great power is a not so great power in Russia, and a weak power, or a weak country, I should say, can be successful in defending their territory. Two CEOs I'm aware of, or founders and CEO, have traveled to Ukraine. One was a gentleman who was on the stage before we got here, Palmer. He was on the ground, checking out what was going on. Then founder, CEO of Palantir also was out there. Interesting to me that those are the folks who want to see what's going on the ground in this battlefield that seems to be the place where we're going to see how technology is going to impact the warfare today. I'd love to get each of you to talk about what you're seeing in Ukraine and what it means for the technologies, AI, and how it's going to impact today's fight. Let's start.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that's impacted, kind of drone technologies we've seen is there's constant, jamming of radio links, jamming of GPS, and all the things. And if you are emitting, radio signatures from where you're controlling drones, you are a target. That is a risk. And so the desire and need to really think about what your signature is, what's actually happening, and how are you going to operate in this contested environment is one of the first real proving grounds of what does and does not work. I think nearly every drone company that's been deployed into there has had the same reaction. Very little works on that communication link. You got to actually very quickly innovate on it and solve these problems. And we saw a similar thing when we, kind of first had some technologies deployed. It was like, all right, kind of works in this region, but as soon as you go close to the front, here's these problems that are showing up. And so, we've had to react very quickly, and I think because of the model that, all the companies here share, we've been able to very rapidly spin modifications, enhancements, improvements to start to address this environment. But that sort of constant jamming, that contested environment, is a very real problem. It has basically made most of the technologies kind of very limited in effect, and puts a lot of the soldiers there at risk if you don't handle it well.
Brandon, you got 30 seconds on this one.
Yeah, not gonna, everything Brian said is accurate. If I could take another view on it, what I think was really interesting about Ukraine, prior to Ukraine, right, the US had said, we're gonna modernize. SecDef Mattis said, you know what, we're gonna focus on Russia, we're gonna focus on China, we're focusing on existential threats, right? Call in my opinion. I think a lot of the world said, you know what, that makes sense, we're gonna start modernizing our militaries as well. What's really interesting is during those first few months in the Ukraine, what happened? And you saw a lot of traditional assets being decimated by much smaller weapon systems. And so what I have seen at the macro level, which I think is interesting, as I talk to a lot of international partners, international countries, they're saying, look, I don't want a bunch of helicopters because I'm seeing what a Stinger missile does to a helicopter. How can I accomplish my mission with distributed risk at a lower cost? And so they're looking at drones. And not to say that you don't need that helicopter on the battlefield, but you might not need 40 of them. You might just say, hey, if I can get away with 5 helicopters and 500 drones, maybe I can accomplish 99.9% of my missions. And so that's something I think is really interesting that's happening at the macro level.
Adam, you got the last word on this.
So I agree with all that. I mean, I think one clear lesson is the drones are here to stay and they really matter. There's a slightly different lens on this that I think is also interesting. So we have the great joy of being a US underdog company in the civilian markets competing against DJI, Chinese company. And I think over the last few years, there's been kind of this building theme of there's probably some serious security risks associated with using DJI drones. We probably shouldn't be using them for national security critical applications. And I think the threat and the risks there always seemed a little bit theoretical, what are they going to do with the data? Why does that really matter? And I think that the conflict in Ukraine has unfortunately really made that crystal clear. So in the early days of the conflict, the Ukrainians were using a lot of DJI drones for surveillance. The first thing to notice there is that these civilian drones, even civilian drones owned by civilians, became strategically relevant in the conflict. And then the second piece of that is that the Russians were using another piece of DJI technology to use the Ukrainian drones against them, to track their location, to pinpoint them and to target them, and it literally became a life and death issue. And I think that unfortunately that really highlights the risks that are out there, not just in a military context, but even in a civilian context, and the targeting vectors that are available.
So what we're using, but also where we're getting the stuff from matters a lot.
Yeah, it really matters.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our guests today, Adam, Brandon, and Brian, for a fantastic panel.
Thanks.